talking about and continuing the conversation that we've all been having at every point of contact, and faith-based, partnering with faith-based. We changed the title actually from the schedule because we want to emphasize the positive, not the non-faith, not the nons. There are a lot of nons out there, but we want to emphasize how we as faith-based people, or actors as they're often called, how we can partner with a variety of organizations, and that we really have something very valuable to bring that is being noticed. And there really is a groundswell now in emerging trends and practice, engagement and practice is saying we need to look through a faith lens, a faith-sensitive lens at the local community and say, what are they saying they need? And often those local communities are faith communities. Many of them are Christian faith communities. And for a variety of aspects of well-being and mental health and recovery and prevention, we have something to bring. We need to engage those qualities in those people, and they want to engage with how their faith supports them through crisis and builds their resilience. So, with that,
Thanks. I just want to remind us of the vision and really the purpose for our gathering, because we're going to hit on a couple of these points in the next 30 minutes. We have until 4. We're going to end then. Just remember, we want to discuss establishing a collaborative network of practitioners working in cross-cultural settings and international contexts for trauma-impacted communities, etc. And then our goal is to develop best practices in the areas of cross-cultural competence, etc., and partnership with secular organizations. So Michelle and I briefly, by interacting with you, we're going to hit more on collaborative network stuff right now, and faith-based and not faith-based partnerships, okay? Partnerships, principles, working together. Next slide is, right. Going back to the Sustainable Development Goals, there's 17, and this is the 17th one, which deals with partnerships and the utter necessity to work across sectors, across organizations, faith-based, non-faith-based, society, United Nations, the academy, private sector, pharmaceuticals perhaps, who knows. And so that's what we're about now. We're using this as a reference point. We're also using, if we go to the next slide, another, let's just put it on. Yeah, okay, thank you. And one of the most important principles that we've encountered, whether we're in the towers, whatever that means, with people at high levels, or down in the trenches getting dirty, like some of the things Tim was describing, is that we need to learn the language and the terms of our secular, or lack of a better term, counterparts and colleagues. Okay? We come in with a lot of spiritualese, Bible verses. Obviously, that's not the way to go. So if we can quote chapter and verse with specific landmark documents by the United Nations, the world community, we're going to be in a better place. So this is one of them. This is, I won't tell you where this is from, you're going to have to guess, but we the peoples of the United Nations determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and the dignity and worth of the human person, and the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life and larger freedom. Where does this come from? Why am I wasting your time to go through this, whatever this is about? Where does it come from? Any idea? 1945, the Charter of the Charter of the United Nations. This is the preamble. Keep in mind what was going on back there. The atrocities, 50 million plus people killed in World War II. We've got to do something different, folks. We've got to unite. And back then, with the 45, 50 countries or so member states, nation states who were there, we've got to find a mechanism to take out our differences around the conference table and not on the battlefield. So there is a history that we need to understand and not just say terms and be fluent with some of the documents. There's a history why the United Nations and groups like that is trying to do what they're trying to do. So my point here is we try to go after faith-based partnerships, and working and kind of expanding our borders carefully, our exposure boundaries in Gestalt terms, right? Using the SDG, especially 17, Principles of Partnership, using this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948 would be another key document, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, can really serve us well. And we found that to be very helpful when we quote chapter and verse.
And in many of these documents, there's specific reference to freedom of conscience and religion, and to even change that if you desire.
If you've read the actual Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which you probably have, there's 30 articles, number 18 and 19 deal with that. Freedom of conscience, freedom to have a religion, freedom to not have a religion, or to change a religion, to meet for religious purposes, etc. Very important things to know. Not that it's respected in a lot of places, but at least because it's in hundreds of languages. It's something.
And Convention on the Rights of the Child, it's repeated there very explicitly about the role of religion and children needing that kind of education.
Okay, next slide, please. Here's a few examples of some faith-based related documents that are out there, and it could be updated. There's lots. I don't know if Michelle, you want to just run through a couple of those? Mention a couple?
Yeah.
And these are all hot links. This is, I'm sorry.
They're all hot links.
This is on our website, even right now. I just put it up while Dear Toon was talking. It's memorycare.org at the very top. So you can find it there on a previous presentation too.
Yeah. And this first resource and milestone up here from the World Health Organization is building from common foundations, the World Health Organization and faith-based organizations in primary care. And that was 2008. So it was guidelines that were collaborated upon by the World Health Organization and faith-based partners. So primary health care. Now we're getting documentation around guidelines coming through in various forms in different places with faith-based organizations around any kind of mental health program, any health program. So in 2015, the World Bank sponsored a dialogue on ending extreme poverty. They titled their document, A Moral and Religious Imperative. The Pope has a beautiful Caring for Our Common Home. We encourage people to read that, this encyclical on creation care. It's beautifully written. And then in faith-based healthcare in the Lancet Medical Journal in 2015. This was in response, had a landmark article in response to the Ebola crisis, where the Ebola crisis would not have been contained. And they were really doing a lot of the wrong things in terms of containment, even though at WHO, previous to this, this serious epidemic, they had, set up this whole, it was like a nerve center, and they had it in the basement where if anything happened, this nerve center could still operate, and they were struggling with all their expertise because they weren't looking at the faith-based, how to engage faith-based actors, pastors, and the burial rituals that people had were just spreading the disease because they have to touch the body, they have to do all these things, and at the most toxic moment they were doing this. So it's like, how do you contain this? Well, they had people that were giving, they got involved, and then out of that they produced this paper that really described how, yes, this is an element that has to be in everything that we do. So I'm not going to go into International Partnership on Religion and Sustainable Development. That's another website. And I also want to just mention at the, it's not even down at this one. UNHCR Faith and Protection Dialogue. This was the first time the UNHCR in 2012, they had a dialogue where they brought actors together, faith-based and people in their group, to really look at, it was an explorative, they called it an explorative dialogue. So they weren't even sure where this was going to end up. And you have major principles within the UN around impartiality and any kind of intervention. And there were people's stereotypes that are non-Christian and non-faith-based about faith-based groups. Like, oh, they can't be impartial. That was one in particular. But that was landmark because they were one of the first groups that really put it out there. But they needed partners in the local communities. So, all right. Okay.
So could you go to the next slide, please? So we've developed a framework that works for us. Shared briefly, it's called the Global Integration Framework, and this is how we define it. And I think you'll see every phrase is there for a reason, something to latch on, and it represents ways and directional ways to connect more with our secular counterparts and Christian counterparts and so forth. It's a framework to actively and responsibly engage in our world, locally through globally for God's glory. Okay, and how do we do this? We do it by connecting relationally and contributing relevantly on behalf of human well-being and the issues facing humanity. Okay, we're okay so far, I hope, nothing new. We do this in light of our integrity, commitments, and core values, such as values like ethical values, ethical codes of practice, humanitarian values, human rights values, and faith-based values. And for example, as we're talking about principles and connecting with NGOs and so forth, that really fits in right here with connecting relationally and contributing relevantly. We talked about contributing relevantly earlier in terms of learning the language, learning the lingo, familiarize ourselves with some of the documents. But one of the things we've noticed as we've interacted with UN folks or international NGOs at different levels is that relationship is so key. We invite people back to our home, and it's a thing which might not actually be mentioned so much or emphasized. It might be a functional kind of relationship for the sake of the task, people will get together, but at a truly mutually supportive level, that's something which people might not really have within their own organizations necessarily. And so we're introducing that in whatever way we can, building these kinds of personal relationships, not just task-based relationships. So connecting relationally is part of that. Going back to the other slide. And this really is part of our philosophy as we share about the global integration framework and what we're trying to present today. We believe a variety of people must be at the global table in order to help shape and influence agendas, policies, and action in the global trenches. That includes people from all countries, all sectors, and all faith backgrounds. People who are informed and skilled and dedicated to the common good. So the strapline we use for the global integration framework, and we send out an update every month with some topic, is common ground for the common good. Common ground for the common good. Lest you think that we are compromising our faith, okay, by being syncretistic, common ground, common good, world is one, feels good. You know, well, so I'm being a little knucklehead when I'm saying that, but as a believer, I'm all fine with common ground for common good, but 1 Corinthians 3:11, no one can lay a foundation other than that which has been laid, which is Christ Jesus. So, I got some bedrock under our common ground for the common good, and it's Jesus Christ. That is something even deeper than what unites me with my secular colleagues. So whether I wear that on my sleeve and talk about it might be another issue. But that fits for me theologically. Bedrock is Christ, but on top of that, the Missio Dei, the image of God in all of us, impels us to work together for the common good. Religion and faith, as we know, have a central place for most people in the world. 85% of the world has a faith commitment and a faith affiliation. 15% are in the minority, secular, you might say. And so central place for most, including many persons and communities of concern, vulnerable populations, as well as staff, organizations, governments, and donors. Faith-based people are thus often mainstream contributors and partners and not marginal players when it comes to the efforts to transform the world. Remember what the title of the UN Sustainable Development Goals are? It's called Transforming Our World. The one previously, the year after, Restoring Humanity, an agenda for humanity, these lofty, almost messianic, salvific goals out there, these big things. But it's not going to happen without the faith-based community and people really in here. Emphasis on personal transformation, including things like virtue and moral integrity, is often an important additive contribution from the faith-based sector. And then note, faith is often the core part of one's life and identity, and not simply a component of one's life or identity, or something to utilize as part of your agenda, so your secular agenda. We're going to use you, you're going to fit in with our needs, and vice versa, because some of our secular colleagues feel the same thing. You got this proselytization agenda, you got this agenda, so there can be some mutual suspicion there. So this is a key component, though, I think, as we work, key perspective, something we bring on the table, the importance for individual and personal transformation, not just say, looking at good policies, good practices, societal shifts and stuff like that, but at an individual and community level, seeing those shifts happening.
This is what's catching the attention of some, quote, secular researchers, seeing whole communities lifted from poverty. I'm thinking of the Pentecostal movement in South America, and they're seeing that what's happening, there's personal transformation, and they're looking and talking about, oh yeah, they engage in these practices in the church, and they're talking about transformation, and they are having to use the same theological language in their research because it's there and you can't get around it. This is what's changing people's lives, Christ, and the decision to follow him, follow hard after him. So this is helping with gender-based violence. It's helping with substance abuse, and things are happening. People's lives are being transformed, and that's being noticed.
If I could add to that, a phrase we've started to use a little bit with as we train or talk about this is, don't be apologetic of your faith. Like, oh, excuse me, I'm faith-based. And so we disguise it with like a real euphemistic term. I'm a Christian, I believe in Jesus Christ. Okay, it's okay. You're Muslim, you're not a Muslim, you're secular, it's okay. It's okay to say that. So don't be apologetics, don't be apologetic, but don't wear apologetics on your sleeve necessarily. Okay? I'm going to prove that the existence of God and the deity of Christ, etc. Okay. Any other slides? Okay. So we have an 8-point summary of our global integration model. It's online on our website, nevercare.org. But this is one of the 8 points. I don't know if you would agree with this or not, and then I'm going to pass the torch to Michelle to share some more. So global integration, and speaking as a believer in Jesus Christ and follower, we recognizes that our globalizing world community must prioritize well-being for all people, lasting peace, justice, prosperity, and the enduring protection of the planet. So the people-planet nexus is what global integration is about, well-being for that. As Christians, our global involvement includes the central mandate, our duty, desire, delight, to share the good news and our good works with all people and all people groups. Now, I'm not trying to be euphemistic, but I'm not trying to talk about converting people, which is part of this, and sharing about Jesus Christ and the utter necessity to be saved from our sin, which is all part of our theology. We understand that. We're just trying to find the simplest, most accurate term that might not offend. It'll offend someone. And so this is one of the things we talk about. Good news, good works for all people and people groups. Anyway. Further, we see the foundation that underlies G emphasis as on common ground for common good as being the historical personage of Jesus Christ. We thus also acknowledge the underlying, again, this is really key. And when we start talking about the United Nations, some people frankly freak out, and I don't blame them, church people, more conservative folks. But when we start talking about this, and how God is using all kinds of people in the trenches on the ground, Christian and otherwise, it helps a bit, usually. So we thus also acknowledge the underlying reality of God and his redemptive purposes in Jesus Christ in dealing with the undermining reality of evil and human sin. So we have about 8 points like this that explain more of this framework, and this framework which then opens the door for connecting more with secular major movements and emphases happening in our world. I don't know what the next slide is, but I think it's not needed.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
so to end with, I'm going to quickly go through some slides that have to do with a learning platform that you can actually become involved in, and you can actually contribute to. That's what's even more exciting. And it's called the Joint Learning Initiative, the JLI for short, on faith and local communities. And in the run-up to the World Humanitarian Summit in 2015, within the humanitarian context of emergencies and all, there was a global effort to try to put forth an agenda that fit with the SDGs in the humanitarian and disaster area. And they had a summit in Istanbul, and prior to that summit, the faith communities from all over the world had their own summit to link with this Transforming Humanity document. And they met for a couple of days, and there were leaders from all the major faiths were there, and they were saying, how can we collaborate?
The document
The
was
document is
One Humanity Shared Responsibility, 2016.
One Humanity Shared Responsibility. And so, prior to this joint learning initiative developed, and I was in on a meeting at some point, but sort of lost contact with it, and recently I was like, oh my goodness, they have just moved on from strength to strength. I'm so excited. So I wanted to share that with you. And what is it? It's an international collaboration of academics. It's kind of what we're doing here, but on a global scale. And it's a great place for just finding articles. They have an annotated bibliography that is mind-blowing. Practitioners and policymakers. And they are gathering research evidence around faith groups' activities in humanitarian action and development, and now they've expanded that to include other areas. So they have some let me just look now at their learning hubs, because there may be a hub that you're particularly interested in. Work through shared learning. They review, map, and assess what is already known about the role and impact of faith groups in development, health, and well-being of communities. And this is sort of their model. Convening, bring together experts from policy, practice, and academia. Secondly, gather evidence on faith-based engagement through scoping evidence, review case studies, and interviews. And you'll see an example of this in a minute. And then 3, communicate, using the evidence to inform and improve policy and practice between faith groups, humanitarian and development communities. And then commission joint hub work to respond to research gaps and collaborate on research. And this is an exciting part, because we talked before about if we're going to engage, we need to know who the players are, we need to learn the language, and if you just go on this website and start reading, you'll start learning the language. And you'll begin to see like, wow, you can frame that kind of intervention that's very spiritual, very Christian spiritual, and call it that, and actually that's what it is, and it's having this effect. And I think that's the work that you're doing, Pat, it's like you're gathering evidence to show the transformational effect, and that could be fed in to this joint learning initiative. Absolutely. Okay, so the current learning hubs that are open. So they have learning hubs that last about 3 years, and they have one on anti-human trafficking and modern slavery, another one on ending violence against children, another on gender-based violence, all things we've been talking about, mobilization of local faith communities to meet needs, and then refugees and forced migration. So when the Global Compact on migration from the UNHCR, or on refugees, came out just at the end of last year, they had a brief, so they collected their thoughts and a response to that. And I think, on refugees, so that would have fit with the refugees and forced migration. previous joint learning hubs that they've had. HIV and maternal health, an immunization hub, peace and conflict hub. So there's 3 years of learning. They do a scoping study before they open a hub, and to sort of see, well, where are the areas that we need to look into? What's the scope of the study going to look like? And then people step up to do things, I guess, or they find out what already has been done. So they're going to build on that. A resilience hub, mobilizing of local faith communities hub. So there are resources in all those areas, and as it were, evidence-based and practice. You can read about it, what people are doing, and different organizations. World Vision is very involved in this. A number of organizations you would recognize. Yeah.
I have a question because this is attention that I live in as an advisor with working with some local groups that are developing different interventions, but there's not necessarily evidence-based collection and yet there's informal feedback, and working also with this international community ISC guidelines for MHPSS and keeping in mind all those different hats and perspectives. How do they take the work that they've done in doing that literature review and helping with the collection and linking that into as well global conversations where they're reviewing best practices, especially right now as it relates to community-based programming, where there's a huge need. There's lots of UN, WHO sponsored and scaling up different things like MHGAP and things to connect this into those global initiatives as well of what the faith communities are doing.
That's a very good question, and I am still learning about this hub because I could spend hours on it. I get lost in it, and just one thing after another. And for psychosocial programming, actually, Karen has kindly put an article in the packet that I wanted people to have, just to give you a flavor for what is on this website. And I think it's a relevant one too. So they do reference the global agendas all the time, and so and partial reply to your question, but the more as it comes down to on the ground what you're asking, I can't really speak to that. I know you might find something on the website or in one of the hubs, examples, and you say, oh, that's interesting. I can get some information from that. Is that? You can talk to me later.
Maybe I'll talk to you.
Okay, all right. I'm not sure.
The resource you mentioned, which is not to answer your question, is related to a number of similar ones that IASC puts out, which we should all be familiar with. About MHPSS and emergency settings,
Psychosocial program.
Yeah.
2007, and then subsequent documents, all online for free.
Yeah.
In multiple languages. Yeah. Okay. Now, in the lead up to that summit, that World Summit, where a lot of faith leaders, they put together 5 evidence briefs that followed the 5 principles of this One Humanity Shared Responsibility document. And I just want to reference that. That's the kind of work that the people that are involved in this joint learning initiative are doing. And some of the main players are from Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh. Alistair Ager, he's written books that you might be very interested in, and his wife Wendy is a consultant. He's a man of faith. If you talk to him, you find out he's a worship leader in his church. He's at Columbia Mailman School of Public Health as well. So you'll often see one or the other or both designations. A really nice guy. And then there's someone at a woman of Muslim faith at the Refugee Study Center at Oxford. So these are the types of people that are on board in this learning community, helping to funnel in things or do the scoping studies. And then, but I just want to say all of us kind of contribute here. But I'm not going to go into this now. But here's the annotated. This is just their homepage at the moment. I just thought I'd show that to you. But keeping faith in 2030, religions and the Sustainable Development Goals, findings and recommendations. So if you're saying, oh well, how do I engage with that document? Like, what is someone saying about how faith communities or faith actors can engage? You'll get some ideas there. Resource brief on the other side, faith actors in implementation of the Global Compact on Refugees. So, and in the article you have, there were 4 implications that you'll see this in a box on the front page of the article. It's in your packet, and I'll leave you to look at that. But it says here that, there's a case for, but there's also a challenge. We are challenged as, in this case, psychosocial programming, but faith-sensitive psychosocial programming. And it says the role of faith in supporting well-being and recovery, and the importance of engaging with local capacities and institutions. Everyone that's talked here about about international involvements has been very sensitive to that local piece. I appreciate that, and how you do that I think is fascinating. Both point to the relevance of faith-sensitive psychosocial programming. Humanitarian law supports it, and humanitarian agents are potentially discouraged from engaging. I mentioned this before with religion because of concerns about partiality and proselytism, Kelly mentioned, and the potential for religion to ferment conflict. But actually they've done a study on that. And they're saying, that's a stereotype that really is not supported. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but across the board, that is a stereotype that really doesn't fit the picture. And lastly, there's a need to develop, document, and disseminate appropriate faith-sensitive program practices more effectively. So how effective, this is my challenge to many of you who are developing these pioneering interventions. How can we disseminate it? How can we provide evidence base for it so that we can communicate with others about it? I'm going to end. I just do want to mention, they have a guide to excellence for evidence and faith groups. So they are developing right now a paper on how that could give you guidelines on how to maybe measure faith elements. Yeah. Why should faith groups care about evidence? How does faith shape our understanding of evidence? And how can faith groups get started or get better at collecting and using evidence? Yeah. So they have some practical guidelines and steps to understand it, and they're also now developing Kingdom Impact Framework, measuring and communicating social and spiritual impact. So there's some really good thinking out there to stimulate your thoughts. And this is a framework that's in development right now to help researchers so that we can communicate why are our deepest values transforming? Why are they really not just, and sort of an added thing, but actually fundamental to why something may work? I want to quote. The purpose of this guide is to support, I'll skip that. Okay, this is in this guidelines framework. Understanding, quote, what works and what doesn't requires people of faith to include their deepest spiritual values in the measurement and evidence process. We recognize and encourage distinctive faith-inspired perspectives on evidence because we want to include the spiritual dimensions that are present in all people. The spiritual is not a separate dimension. Therefore, we seek evidence frameworks which capture the holistic, integrated nature of every person. And I think actually some of those values and understandings have been expressed almost through many people here. And Tim, something that you said, it's just like, it's already been expressed here, what they're saying there. So I just wanted to let you know about that, and you'll enjoy looking through it. Well, so it's a new day. There are many hopeful signs that the unique impact that we can have in our deepest spiritual values can people, to recognize the light that is in us and how that can transform others. And bring hope.
Well, you've given us so many resources. You're all gonna have months to dig into, study things, so the next time we come together, we'll be even more informed, right?